The UFC's most plausible conspiracy theories part 2. Conspiracy theories in MMA is such an interesting topic and it really gets a conversation going. You guys really enjoyed the first episode of this series, so I decided to make another one. But before we get the video started, my name is JuicyMMA. I make opinionated fight breakdowns. If you're ready, hit that subscribe button and let's get right into it. Conspiracy theories are such an interesting topic in honestly any aspect of life. It's the story behind the story, and especially for MMA and especially for the UFC, a lot of fans like to talk about different conspiracies. And in episode 1, we talked about a lot of different UFC conspiracy theories that made a lot of sense to me. And in this video, we're going to be doing more of the same. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the first plausible UFC conspiracy theory that I want to touch upon is everybody is on the juice. Now this is actually something that I made a standalone video about, but the conspiracy theory here is essentially all of the fighters in the UFC are on some sort of PEDs. It doesn't have to be pure steroids, but a lot of fans think most fighters in the UFC are on something of some sort. And the reason why fans feel this way comes down to a couple different factors, but the first factor I want to touch upon is the size. Because there's been a bunch of examples of certain UFC fighters being in good shape for the most part of their UFC careers, but all of a sudden when they're 34 or 35 years old, or maybe even older than that, they come in the best shape of their UFC careers, which obviously is not something that's common for natural humans. But outside of just the shape of the fighters in the latter half of their careers, another reason for why fans feel this way comes down to the cardio of certain guys. Because there definitely have been certain examples in the UFC of certain fighters having pretty bad cardio in one fight, and then in their next fight, it seems like their cardio is actually incredibly good, which of course doesn't appear to be all that natural. Now, outside of those couple factors that I mentioned, other factors that fans point to is the size of fighters' heads increasing over the years, fighters' chins improving over the years, fighters all of a sudden getting significantly more power over the years. There definitely are a bunch of different reasons for why fans feel a lot of different fighters are on the juice in some manner. Now, a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, do I personally think this claim is legitimate? Well, in my opinion, I think the answer to this is yes. When you talk about certain fighters increasing their head size over the years, when you talk about certain fighters improving upon their chins, improving upon their cardio, improving upon their power, for the most part, these are not things that you traditionally talk about when talking about natural fighters. Usually when you talk about having a better chin, better power, better cardio, and what have you, usually those are things that get worse as time progresses. The more damage you take, the worse your chin is normally going to get. So the fact that in certain fighters we see the reverse of this is definitely a little bit eye-opening. And in my opinion, I do think this conspiracy theory is relatively plausible. But one thing I do want to add to this is I don't think the UFC is complicit in this. I think they are legitimately testing their fighters, or at least the anti-doping body that they work with is legitimately testing the fighters. I just think a lot of these fighters are getting around those tests. Allegedly, of course. Now, the next plausible conspiracy theory that I wanted to touch upon is the UFC wants certain fighters or champions to lose. Now, the claim here is the UFC obviously is a business, and there obviously are certain fighters that would make them more money. Certain fighters or certain champions that would make them more money in those elevated positions. So because of that, the UFC would prefer certain guys to win fights. Like for example, Paddy Pimblett to beat Justin Gaethje, or for example, Sean O'Malley to become a UFC champion. There definitely are certain fighters that they would prefer to be champions and prefer to win fights. And in turn, there are certain guys like Aljamain Sterling, Movsar Evloev, Magomed Ankalaev, and what have you, that they would prefer to lose fights and not become UFC champions. Now, another question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, do I think this claim is plausible? In my opinion, I think the answer to this is yes. I do think it's plausible. Dana White just did an interview a couple of weeks or a couple of months back where he was specifically asked about this, if there were certain fighters that he would prefer to lose, and he said explicitly yes, there were certain fighters that he would prefer to lose. Now, the angle that he took in that interview was there were certain guys that he didn't see eye to eye with, and because of that he wanted them to lose. Now, of course, he didn't talk about specific guys, but he did mention that in the interview. But in my opinion, I think it goes a step further than that. I think certain fighters that are not good for business for the UFC and for Dana White are guys that him and the UFC would prefer to lose. Now, of course, all this is allegedly, but I do think there is some pretty good evidence to support this claim. So I do think overall it is very plausible. Now, the next claim that I want to touch upon is certain champions are protected. Essentially, what the claim here is there certain fighters that are good for business from the UFC's perspective that become champions. And because of that, the UFC would prefer those guys to stay as champions for as long as possible. So at that point, what the UFC would try to do is accommodate those fighters as much as possible to keep them as champions. And what that really means is they would give those fighters fighters easier stylistic matchups for them, and in turn avoid more difficult stylistic matchups for those champions. Outside of that, they would give them a little bit more time in order to rest and in order to be in their best possible shape going into their next title defense. They would also put them in arenas that are very favorable for the champion. They would force their opponents to fight on short notice to give the champion that much more of an advantage. There definitely are certain things that the UFC can do to give an advantage to some of their champions that they may otherwise like, and that's essentially the claim here. But of course, another question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, do I think this claim is legitimate as well? Well, in my opinion, once again, I think the answer to this question is yes. I do think this claim is pretty plausible. When you talk about a guy in Alex Pereira when he was champion at light heavyweight and the UFC was essentially avoiding Magomed Ankalaev for some time. Now eventually of course they fought, but for some time it seemed as if they were avoiding him. It really did feel as if the UFC preferred Alex Pereira to stay as champion, and they would prefer him to go up against guys that were easier stylistic matchups for Alex. Now outside of just the Pereira example, there have been more examples of this as well, but essentially I do think this claim is very plausible. I don't necessarily have any hardcore evidence to definitively say this is true or not, but at the end of the day, based upon the evidence that we do have, I think it's at the bare minimum very plausible that this is true. Now the next claim I want to touch upon is bad judges are used to push the UFC's favorites. Now essentially the claim is, as I mentioned before, there are certain fighters that are good for business from the UFC's perspective. So because of that, there are certain bad judges that the UFC can use in order to essentially force the guys that are better for business to win certain fights. And a lot of fans point to the fight between Jared Gordon and Paddy Pimblett as a perfect example of this. But a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, do I think this claim is legitimate? Well, in my opinion, I see where fans are coming from, but at the same time, I don't really think this claim is legitimate, and I definitely don't think it's nearly as legitimate as the previous claims that I touched upon before in this video. I don't really feel as if the UFC is paying off certain judges to have some of their favorites actually win fights, even if they otherwise would not have won it. I think a much more realistic explanation for this is the UFC just has bad judges. We've seen it on multiple occasions in the past, and I think the fight between Jared Gordon and Paddy Pimblett just involved bad judges. I think there's a lot of judges in the UFC that don't really know what they're watching and don't know how to accurately, consistently score fights, and I think the fight between Jared Gordon and Paddy Pimblett is another example of that. I don't think it's super realistic to say that the UFC is actually paying off the judges in order to give Paddy Pimblett the fight in that particular example, or give particular fighters that are better for business from the UFC's perspective wins in other examples. I just don't think this claim is all that plausible, to be completely honest. But anyways, if you guys enjoyed the video and want to support the channel, be sure to hit that join button for members only live streams, videos, discounted merch, best bets, alongside with additional perks as well. I wanted to thank all my current channel members. You guys do an amazing job at keeping the videos coming and keeping the channel going, and once again I wanted to say thank you. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think these conspiracy theories are plausible, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy it, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.